Welcome. We continue the afternoon with more from Roadshow by CNET, the state of autonomy.
All right, thank you, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to my panelists. Today we're going to talk about the state of autonomy. I think it's always interesting this time of year to look back at the developments of the past 12 months and to see what's changed from a technology standpoint, from a legislative standpoint, and ultimately from a kind of a cultural standpoint too, because increasingly that's part of the discussion, the acceptance of autonomous cars, what people think about autonomous cars. And we've had some news, of course, this past 12 months that's had some pretty strong reactions. I want to introduce my panelists. On my far left is David Byron, Manager of Design and Innovation Strategy at Sundberg Farrar, and Sam Abulsamid, who is the Senior Analyst at Navigate Research. Thank you guys for joining me today. I want to start by talking about the regulatory landscape. You know, laws are not the most exciting topic, I know, but they're such a hugely important aspect of autonomy and research and development and testing, which is probably the most important part of things right now. Sam, were there any major changes last year in terms of regulation? Because it seems like we pretty much stayed more or less stagnant.
Yeah, first of all, NHTSA in the fall unveiled version 3 of their automated driving guidelines, which this is the third iteration of it, and they've continued to refine it. Making things voluntary, in terms of trying to collect data and the safety reports that companies are encouraged to submit. And we've seen a bunch of companies actually publish those reports, including Ford and Zoox and Waymo. Waymo was actually the first one out the door, GM Cruise, and several others over the past 6 months. On the actual regulatory side, the Safe Self-Drive Act and the what was the other one? The two bills that were in Congress essentially died at the end of the last session because they never got reconciled and passed into law. I expect that probably within the next 6 months we'll see those come back up again. We did see late in the year an attempt, some amendments to the Senate bill that would have that tried to address some of the concerns about the earlier version of the bill, to mandate some of the data collection, the data sharing from the companies in this space, and start to move towards putting together a framework for some future regulations, some motor vehicle safety standards around this technology. But as of this moment, there aren't any specific laws, and nothing has really changed. We're pretty much where we were a year ago.
And a few states also indicated an interest in autonomy research. Illinois and Maine, I think, both launched programs to kind of research autonomous cars and the implications of those cars. But still, it's very early. Still, it's very much these states trying to figure out how can we kind of capitalize on that and how much is this going to cost us.
And what's trying to understand what is the state's role in this? I mean, traditionally, the state's role in vehicle or transportation regulation has been licensing of drivers and registration of vehicles, and the federal government has had responsibility for ensuring the safety of the vehicles. As you get into virtual drivers, the software is the vehicle driver. Where's the state fall into that in terms of regulating that? And I think everybody's still trying to understand what that piece of the puzzle is.
David, do you think that puts us on a bit of a disadvantage when it comes to the global marketplace, when it comes to development of this kind of technology?
We're definitely a little slower than some other emerging markets. So we need to realize that this is a wave that's coming, and it's good to see state after state after state take action. This movement slowly by states is giving consumers more confidence, and that's what we're seeing.
Yeah.
And the confidence is increasing that, okay, if my state is finally looking at this, I have a little bit more confidence that when products start to be noticed out on the road, there are measures being taken to make sure it's being done safely. But we do need to catch up, especially with how aggressive some of the Asian countries are in opening the doors.
And confidence is such an incredibly huge part of this, because it's not the kind of technology where I can invest in a new phone, for example, and I can use this phone in isolation. As people are adopting these sorts of technologies, it impacts everybody on the road. So it's not the kind of thing where you can just worry about early adopters. You really have to get everybody to buy in. And of course, one of the biggest challenges in this past year was the unfortunate Uber incident, which I believe was in March of last year, in which one of Uber's self-driving test cars in the greater Phoenix area struck a pedestrian and unfortunately killed them. And that, of course, was probably the most publicity that autonomous cars have ever seen. Of course, it was incredibly negative publicity. David, we were talking a little bit before. You saw some indications of the sort of immediate reaction that consumers had and how that impacted their confidence in this technology. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's very common with a news story that you see that immediate spike in negative conversation. And prior to that, things were just on a real rapid trajectory of interest and positive conversation amongst consumers and the industry. And then when the accident happened, you have about a 2-week time frame of this immediate spike of negative conversation. But it did taper off, and I think by the end of the summer, things were back to the level they were prior to the accident. I think what happened is a lot of new conversation and a realization that there's a lot of effort required to make this work properly. And when we have conversations with consumers in a lot of the research we do a lot of qualitative consumer activities, they're starting to acknowledge that when it gets to the point that these products come to market, the OEs are putting in a huge amount of effort. And I think that accident, sadly, it was a terrible thing to happen, but it's bringing some positivity because there's a lot more responsibility being taken and a little bit more caution by the companies that are developing this technology. And honestly, consumers are recognizing that.
Yeah, and to follow up on that, I think the state of autonomy overall in the country right now is both good and bad. The bad is that we had a fatality that was directly related to testing this, and the good is the recognition throughout the industry, everybody working on this technology, of just how hard this really is. And before you can fix something, you have to understand there's a problem. And so, what we've seen over the past 12 months is, to some degree, a little bit of a retrenchment as everybody kind of refocuses on the safety of this, ensuring that it is, in fact, going to be safe technology. Because, part of the promotion of autonomous driving is this whole concept of, human error causes 94% of accidents, and we have 37,000, 38,000 people a year die in the U.S. on the roads. And those are both terrible things. But there's also the fact that, given the fact that we drive 3.2 trillion miles a year in the United States, the fact that only 37,000 people a year die is actually pretty remarkable. I mean, that's about just over one fatality for every 100 million miles of driving. Your chances of being in an accident of any kind, much less a fatal one, is about once every 500,000 miles. And if you drive 15,000 miles a year, that's about once every 30 years. So it's actually something that we're really good at, and to make an automated system that's better than that is a really hard thing to do. And so what we're seeing is the bigger players in this business that are trying to develop automated driving have really doubled down on safety, trying to make sure that their test procedures are good. The part of the problem with the Uber accident was both a technical failure of their system, but it was also a human failure of how they train their safety drivers and monitor their safety drivers. And everybody's gone back and taken a look at their processes. Uber in particular has really revamped their entire process, their engineering process and safety process. And so we're now seeing that really coming to the fore as everybody kind of slows down a little bit. And then the smaller players are, instead of focusing on trying to take over the whole industry, they're looking at, okay, well, what are the really tough problems that we need to solve, like predicting what the pedestrians are going to do or other road vehicles are going to do, and solving those problems as part of the bigger picture.
It's really interesting to think of startups focusing on individual aspects, because we all think of this as creating a digital driver and that kind of thing, when it's actually a lot of individual problems that all need to kind of work together and creating a new landscape of startups ultimately. And this, of course, is one of the hottest areas in the startup industry right now, is the automotive space. And to give more startups more opportunities, I think it's a pretty good thing. Coming out of that, of course, was one of the debates was more or less, are these truly autonomous cars? Because if you have an operator sitting behind the wheel who's still kind of responsible for stepping in at some point, as indeed we saw in this Uber situation, are these actually self-driving cars? Are these actually autonomous cars? And we saw Waymo later take the step of bringing their operators who had been sitting in the passenger seat and actually moving them back into the driver's seat. This is maybe a little bit of a religious discussion, but are these truly autonomous cars, self-driving cars they're testing right now, Sam?
Not at this stage, no. I mean, they technically have some capability to do that, but almost no one is actually operating them in a fully autonomous or fully automated way. Everybody still has people in the vehicles. Even Waymo, who launched their Waymo One commercial ride-hailing service in December on a small scale in Arizona, still has safety drivers in the vehicle. They still have people doing sort of a concierge thing to assist riders, to help to understand what the vehicle's doing and answer questions. So and same thing goes for companies like Aptiv and Lyft, who have been operating a pilot in Las Vegas for a year now. They launched last year at CES, and they've done 30,000 paid rides on the Lyft platform in the past year. And they have the safety drivers and the engineers in there monitoring what's going on. But to your point about how people feel about this, once even though some of the surveys show that a majority of people are not comfortable with the idea of self-driving cars or autonomous cars, once they actually ride in one and experience what it's like, most of them actually come back with a very positive experience. And for the Aptiv cars that are running on the Lyft platform in Vegas, right now they have a 4.95 rating from their riders. So they must be doing something right.
I found that Waymo video, that promo, minute and a half long video, interesting because for the first minute, every clip you saw of the steering wheel turning had a person sitting right there, kind of slightly in the side of the camera view. And then they make the statement, this is where we're going. And the last two shots, there's no one in the vehicle at all. And it gave the impression that these vehicles are operating right now with nobody in that vehicle. And part of that is leading to a lot of consumer miseducation on what's actually happening, where companies really are, because that was very misleading. They're not actually doing that. That was just that little caveat of a statement saying, this is where we're going. And if you didn't pay attention to it, you'd watch that commercial, and my mom would look at that and say, oh, those cars are driving around with nobody in it. And I think there's a lot of miseducation. We're all in this box here that we talk about levels of autonomy. We know what level 4 is, but go to your grocery store and ask anybody there, what's level 4 autonomy? They can't tell you. So it's really about how do they feel. And they feel better right now with somebody sitting behind the wheel, not in the passenger seat.
And to that, Waymo actually, they have done testing in Arizona without someone sitting in the driver's seat, but not carrying regular passengers. So they're doing that testing and development, but whenever there's, right at this stage at least, whenever there are passengers in the vehicle, there's someone sitting behind the steering wheel.
And they're presenting that as something that's being done to raise the confidence of the riders, and not something that's needed from a technical standpoint. And ultimately, they did operate for months in their kind of the pre-testing phase with nobody there. Do you think that we can ever get to a point where there's a driver there as a backup and that's still a self-driving car? Is there some threshold of interventions that we cross and at that point is considered to be a self-driving car? Or do you really need to get rid of the steering wheel entirely?
I think ultimately you need to get to that stage if you're actually going to make a business out of this. Because I mean, the whole point of doing automated driving is to be able to eliminate the human controller and reduce that cost, eliminate that cost from the overall operating cost equation. If you can't do that, then you might as well just get rid of all the automation. There's not really much point if somebody's just going to be there as a supervisor. And frankly, part of the problem that we saw with the Uber crash is that it's a very monotonous job. Humans are actually very bad at supervising automation. The other way around can actually work really well. Having automation working to augment the human driver can be very successful. And this is actually something that Toyota is working on. They've got this two-path approach they've got what they call Chauffeur, which is their fully or highly automated driving system where you don't need the human operator. And then they've got what they call Guardian, which you can kind of think of it as analogous to electronic stability control, but you're incorporating all the other sensors that you use for automated driving to have much greater situational awareness beyond things like accelerometers and wheel speed sensors to to supervise the human driver, and if the human driver is doing something that might be too extreme for the vehicle or for the conditions, it can intervene to keep them safe. And the opposite, if human over supervising automation just doesn't work very well.
Yeah, but there's still a lot of value in a person potentially as we're progressing, and if we get to a point where they're operating a fully autonomous car, there's situations where you still need a person. I mean, just look at Uber Eats. They're delivering something. That vehicle's still not able to bring the delivery to your door. Or Uber Wave, which is a great idea, and I can't wait to see that hit more markets, where they have somebody in the vehicle who can go and assist somebody in a wheelchair or who has a disability to get from their front door down to the car. You still need a person there to assist.
Yeah, well, actually, I mean, that's where the project you've been working on kind of comes into play.
Yeah.
Maybe you should talk a little bit about Hyundai Elevate.
Yeah, so we debuted last week at CES a project called Hyundai Elevate that Sunberg Farrar partnered with the Cradle division at Hyundai, and it was to develop a car that could walk. And whenever I say that, people immediately get a puzzled look on their face, and they say, why would you need a car that could walk outside of a Transformers movie? And actually, there's a lot of use cases, and that's one of them that we honed in on, was that imagine you call an autonomous car. What good is that if you're someone who's aging in place and you're trying to still maintain independence, but you can't get from your front door down to the vehicle in the driveway? We don't all have ADA ramps. I mean, America's well serviced with that, but around the world, it's not like that. So if the vehicle in our project concept could actually stand up and crawl or walk over to your front door, level itself, and the wheelchair could roll right into the vehicle, bolt, secure itself down, walk back down to the road, and then continue driving. So maybe in that situation, you could eliminate the Uber Wave physical therapist or certified assistant situation. So maybe that's one use case for it, for sure.
And that's actually a very different application of autonomy as well, because if you envision a situation like that where a car can reach terrain that a normal car could not cross, at that point you kind of have to hand control over to the vehicle, because ultimately there's no way for you to even control it off-road, right?
Yeah, so in developing a car with 4 legs, we talked a lot about how do you control it. And there's no way we would ever ask a consumer to do what you see in some movies or some old designs from the 70s where they're operating, 4 levers and moving around. It's just, there's no way we would ever ask a consumer to do that. So it's going to be more like an HMI system where you just point and direct it where to go, or you touch a point on a map and you guide it. And it's going to rely on the latest in sensor technology, because it's not just now having to avoid a pothole on a flat road. It's having to go over a 4-foot boulder or terrain in an earthquake disaster scenario. So this is an experimental project with the Cradle division, and it's meant to push all of the companies that they're working with in their sensor technology to see what could we achieve and be a leader in that space.
But going back to what you were asking about, can we eliminate the human from this process? And I think at some stage we will be able to eliminate the human operator in the automated vehicle, but there will still be humans involved in the process remotely.
Absolutely.
One of the things that everybody in this space is doing is looking at some sort of remote operation or teleoperation capability as a backup for these systems, because there's always going to be scenarios that pop up, especially when you're operating in a city, where the vehicle's not quite sure what it needs to do. And a prime example is, you're on a side street, there's a truck double parked, somebody's unloading some stuff, and there's a double yellow line. If the vehicle's programmed to obey traffic rules, which they're generally going to do, it knows it's not supposed to cross that double yellow line, but it doesn't want to sit there for 15 minutes waiting.
Yeah, sure.
So, for a human, we would kind of creep out, enough so we could see past it to see if there's anybody coming, and if it's clear, then we'll go around. In the case of an automated vehicle, a remote operator would be able to tap into a live video stream from the sensors on the car, do that same thing, and then give it some hints as to what to do next. Either plot a direct path around that obstacle, or just hint it what it should do. Which, in fact, going that approach, has the potential to also help teach it to make the whole system better as well.
Yeah, we've seen Nissan and some other companies working on technologies
Yeah.
like that, basically creating like an air traffic controller effectively is
Yes.
how they usually refer to it as, someone who can kind of remote into your car almost, like you might remote into a server if you're a server admin, and kind of fix the problem for you, which sounds pretty nice.
Yeah, I love what you're talking about here about a nuanced situation. And we're all thinking about autonomy in these very simple laboratory, almost, southern state, good weather situations, and they can operate in those modes. And what they're not even discussing, but we have conversations with the companies we're working with, is how do you get to a point where they have nuanced behaviors? As a driver, we all do little things that communicate to other drivers what you really want to do, just driver etiquette.
We use nonverbal signals.
Exactly.
We wave to somebody, or a four-way stop, say, okay, you go first.
So when are two vehicles going to be able to come up at the same time and you respectfully decline and let someone pass? Are you as the driver going to be able to have an HMI system that allows you to override what the rule-based algorithm is saying, and you let someone else go first, even though you were the first one to the intersection? That's next level V2V communication that's going to need to be there to make it a satisfying experience. Otherwise, you're going to get in it, and a simple task of going to the grocery store, you get to an intersection and two cars, get in this mode, and I got offended because their autonomous car cut me off.
Yep.
And I've seen a lot of concepts that have tried to define ways to communicate with pedestrians, to maybe shine lasers on the road to draw a path for them and try to give instructions. And I think ultimately they're all a little bit flawed in that they're all trying to define some new standard of interfacing with customers when ultimately, when there's 15 different new standards and none of them are actually standards. One of the more interesting applications I saw was actually Volvo's 360 concept, 360C concept, in that it did try to communicate with pedestrians to say what the car is going to do, but it didn't actually try to have a conversation with the pedestrian. It just said, I'm going to begin to move now, or I'm stopping now, or here's what I'm going to do. Right, which I think is a very different thing than trying to say, here's what you should do. This is saying, here's what I'm going to do. I think that's a subtle but an important distinction from these cars, because if you have 15 different models of cars, each with 15 different ways of interacting, this is going to cause more confusion than anything.
This is what Ford's doing down in with their AVs down in Miami and now in Washington, D.C. They actually started some experimentation in 2017, which you probably saw pictures of a Transit Connect with some mocked-up sensors on it, and the driver was wearing a seat suit, so it looked like there was no driver in the car. And what they were doing was they were experimenting with using different lighting patterns to signal to pedestrians, and they were looking at how pedestrians responded to it to provide that indication of intent. And so what they've done is they took what they learned from that and they've incorporated that into their test vehicles that are running on the roads now. So each one of those vehicles has a light bar on the top of the windshield that flashes in different ways if it's if it's standing still and it's about to take off, or if it's going to slow down, things like that, so that pedestrians understand what it's going to do. And last fall, Ford issued a call to action to the industry to come together and define some standards for that. Because obviously, if you're going to do something like that, everybody needs to do it the same way, so that every pedestrian, regardless of whose brand of AV they're looking at, they see a signal and they interpret it the same way. So I think that's one of the things that I think in the next year or so we'll start to see that get defined as an industry standard.
Ford's also doing some interesting things on the economic side of things in terms of developing a system that would enable a car to be delivering packages during the day when there aren't really that much demands for human transportation, but then being able to move passengers around in the same vehicle later on in the day. Something Mercedes-Benz is also playing with too, with their urbanetic concept as well. Basically an idea of trying to raise the utilization of these cars, because ultimately utilization is what's going to actually make them profitable.
Yeah, I mean, how many times we all have the conversation about our cars sitting 90 to 95% of the time. You're paying all that money and your investment is just sitting useless. So yeah, of course we hear that all the time. We did a research project in China, and one of the topics that came up repeatedly was their desire to make money with their vehicle. They would literally look at their vehicle and say, "It should make me money," and because their cost to get a license is so much more of a sacrifice than it is here just to get the registration license. So they look at that vehicle as something that right now is a big financial draw, and they want to turn that around and say, well, you should go make me money.
And David, we were talking before, you were seeing some interesting trends when it comes to acceptance of autonomous technologies in China versus in the US as well?
Yeah, we've done some work comparing US versus China, acceptance rates, psychology around desires of these experiences. And in China, they're so much more open to the idea. Why is that? I mean, we could speculate about their familiarity with Big Brother technology just in their culture and their lives, but what we heard firsthand multiple times was the comment, if they put it out on the road, I'm sure it's fine. Now that's taken and going to take a lot more effort to convince.
Maybe a little too trusting.
Yes, it's going to take a lot more effort to convince the American population that that is the case. But over there, we heard it over and over and over again. Now it's not everybody. I'm not broad brushing, but we definitely heard it, and we were kind of taken back by it, by how often we heard that comment. And so acceptance rates over there, we saw numbers of 70% that were just sign up, I can't wait till it's here, I'm ready, I'll jump right in. And as you said earlier, in America, it's like 50-50. We've seen that actually get maybe a little bit past 50-50. 5 years ago, when we were doing studies here in the US, it was 70% negative. And we would hear comments like, you're gonna take that steering wheel out of my cold, dead hands. And that would be a common thread in a conversation. And there's still people like that today, but definitely not as many. And now, when we do a study, we separate them into acceptors or rejectors. But the middle, the tipping point when you become a rejector and you become an acceptor, that has vastly moved in the past couple of years. And now you have lots of acceptors. There's a little bit of a clause, though. They'll say, I'll be an acceptor, but I don't want to be the first. So once I see it on the road, then I'll try it. Or especially with older people that work with us, they'll say, I'm sure it's going to be good. I'm sure my grandkids will tell me about it, and then I'll try it, kind of thing. But man, in China, they're just all in, can't wait for it, open and willing.
Yeah, younger age cohorts definitely seem to be more accepting of the idea of giving up the driving task to a machine. But of course, in China, if you've ever been stuck in a Beijing traffic jam, I could certainly see why you would want to, why you would be more than willing to give up driving. So.
And it definitely seems to be one of those things too, where I think, as you mentioned earlier, Sam, once you experience this technology, you are much more likely to be okay with it, and that's an interesting problem because A, as we talked about earlier, it's not exactly legal to even experience this technology in a lot of places. But B, how do you even provide the opportunity for people to experience it? That Waymo video that you mentioned before was how Waymo is trying to give people that experience, the ability to go on YouTube and see what the whole ride is like. But even that doesn't really give you the feeling of actually being in one of these cars. And so increasingly we're seeing more companies trying to move toward that kind of autonomy technology coming into cars that you can attain now and give you a little bit of a taste of that. We've seen things like autopilot stepping up to version 9, which gives the ability to automatically change lanes and take exits off. We've seen technologies like Nissan's ProPilot Assist being available on affordable cars. And we're seeing more and more companies that are trying to push this level 2+ category, which is basically giving a lot of autonomy-like functionality in a car that's still human-driven. So do you think that's enough of a taste to start to get a little bit of momentum going, or is that still
in some respects, I think it might almost be too much of a taste because a lot of the applications that I've seen out there, and I've driven most of these systems that are in production today, and one of the issues with them, with almost all of these systems, is the consumers don't necessarily understand not so much what the systems can do, but more importantly, what they can't do. And so, I mean, we've obviously seen a lot of videos of Tesla drivers doing stupid things with autopilot,
many videos.
because they're more inclined to record what they're doing and post it on YouTube. But I'm pretty certain that we see there's some of the same kinds of things that are happening with other systems out there. And I think one of the things that we need to do is educate the public more. When they get one of these vehicles, to understand what it can do, what it can't do. And also make sure that we include driver monitor systems, better user interfaces to indicate to the driver, if they're using the system inappropriately, like Cadillac does with Super Cruise. They have a very good HMI to monitor the driver, make sure they're staying engaged and aware and ready to take over when they need to, and to indicate when the system can't do what it's supposed to do. And then last week at CES, we got a big announcement from a consortium of companies, including Audi and Zoox and several others, and Toyota as well, I think, of a new coalition called PAVE, Partnership for Autonomous Vehicle Education. And there wasn't a lot of details, but the goal ultimately is to educate the public about what highly automated driving systems can and will eventually be able to do, and also what some of the current generation systems that are in production, like ProPilot Assist, can do and can't do.
One of the real concerns, though, as we are going through this transition phase and how many years or decades this lasts, conversations we hear a lot are around the worry of, you could call it skill set atrophy.
Yeah.
That as you start to rely on a system, you become reliant on it. And then while we have mixed cars, or your spouse's car has a feature and yours doesn't, but you drive yours all the time, and then all of a sudden you get in your spouse's car and it doesn't have lane keep, you forgot how to drive all of a sudden. And this is already happening and becoming a big problem. So OEMs have a big challenge on developing HMI systems and ways to interact with the driver while they're going in and out of these level 2+, level 3 features, because they're going to still be interacting and driving other cars that don't have them. And you can become reliant on it and have serious accidents and failure because you just got lazy because you relied on it so much.
Yeah, the problem is, when the system gets so good at certain aspects that you start to think it can do more than it can.
Yep.
And then when it finally falls over, and then that's where you get into trouble. When you reach those limits, the farther those limits are, the farther out those limits get, the worse the consequences when it fails.
I mean, how many of you, I've done this myself when I got so used to having a backup camera. I mean, how dependent are we all on our backup cameras? And I have one vehicle, though, that doesn't have it. And I'll get in it, and I will look at it like it's there out of just the habit of that. So take that as just a backup camera situation and then extrapolate that out over ADAS things on the highway, and it's a real problem. And so there's a lot of challenges in projects we've worked on trying to get drivers' attention, timing that attention. How are you going to get that? Is it a vibration in the seat? Is it a beep? Is it a light? What is it? And how quickly do they snap out of their lapse in judgment in that moment?
And Sam, you mentioned driver monitoring, something that Cadillac Super Cruise does. I think they're probably the most active production-based model right now in terms of watching the driver. But at CES, we saw Byton, for example, has a camera built in their car, to handle that handoff between the car and the driver. Volvo's announced intent to bring in cameras to cars as well. That, I think, is a very important part of this, to make sure, of course, that the driver's actually paying attention and to give them reminders to make sure they're paying attention. Do you see a privacy risk there? I've certainly heard some grumbling as we've heard these announcements.
Yeah, I mean, there's always a risk, in any sort of monitoring system like that, privacy risk. In general, the systems that we've seen out there so far, none of that data is being communicated outside of the vehicle. It's all being used internally in real time. In the case of the Cadillac system, it's not even using a regular optical camera. It's actually using an infrared camera. It's very analogous to the Face ID system that Apple uses on the new iPhones, except that it's a lower resolution system, because all it's doing is it's checking to make sure that your eyes are watching the road. It's not doing authentication, so it's not at the same degree. So it can't recognize a specific face, but only whether the face in the driver's seat is watching the road. So that, I think there's less privacy risk with a system like that, where some systems that I've seen demoed are using a standard optical camera and then using the face recognition on that. There's a little more potential for a problem there. And then, if any of these companies decide to transmit that data outside the vehicle, that's where you start to run the privacy risks.
And there's already been grumblings on the Apple side of things about whether Apple's actually using that camera data or will use it to basically see if you're looking at a given ad, for how long you're looking at a given ad. And you can certainly envision uses like that down the road too, but we'll not go too far down the tinfoil hat route. Another big thing that came out of CES this year was a lot of C-V2X announcements, which is basically cellular-based vehicle to whatever communications. The ability for a car to talk to a traffic light, for example, or to a car to talk to another car. And this has been something that's been ongoing. This vehicle-to-vehicle communications thing has been going on for decades now. Finally, we see the industry saying, okay, we're not going to go with a proprietary network. We're going to go with the standards-based network. Is that a big trend, do you think, that we'll see in the coming year? David, or how important, I guess, is that in the world of autonomy in general?
It's very important because you have one category where you have vehicles operating by sight, so LiDAR and radar, but there's many situations where that's not enough. So who's had an accident that was caused by a car 2 vehicles in front of you? So your LiDAR can't see through a box truck, and if a situation were to start to develop 2 vehicles in front of you, but your vehicles were communicating through CV2X, then the vehicle could respond quicker. So there's a lot of advantages of this. Also, when you're out of network, and so you're not able to have a vehicle communicate to a network, you could have 2 vehicles just communicate directly to each other. So I think it's a great move. It's very exciting. It's going to definitely speed up and accelerate a lot of R&D development.
Yeah, I agree. Ultimately, the vehicle needs to be able to navigate around its environments based solely on what its sensors can see around itself. But for a really robust system, that's not sufficient.
Right. Yep.
And so you need to be able to see beyond the line of sight that the sensors are limited to. Just like our own line of sight, you want that extra situational awareness of what's happening down the road. And with CV2X, it's using cellular technology, but it's been adapted to allow direct point-to-point communications between the vehicles without going through a network.
Similar that conversation.
Yeah.
We've had people ask, well, what happens when I'm in a rural area and I don't have the network to work off of?
Right.
Well,
So if there's 2 vehicles, they can talk directly to each other. If there's just the one vehicle, then it doesn't really matter. But back to what we talked about earlier with signaling intent. With V2X communications, you have that ability to signal intent between the vehicles. So we have lights and things that we can use, to signal the pedestrians. But it's even better if you can signal directly. If a vehicle, going down the road detects some black ice, it can signal to the vehicles behind it that, hey, you want to maybe slow down a little bit, or pre-charge your brakes, things like that, to be ready in that kind of scenario. Or if you're coming around a curve, if there's a blind curve and there's a car stopped beyond the curve, your sensors aren't going to be able to see that, but your V2X, your V2V system would be able to detect that and start to slow down before you get within visible range of that vehicle.
Yep.
And ultimately that can hopefully help to also mitigate getting into some of the situations that would cause the system to have to make ethical decisions. The classic trolley problem. Mm-hmm. The sooner you can more information you have, the sooner you can make those decisions, you can avoid getting into those unavoidable situations.
And with companies like Qualcomm and Audi getting on board with the CV2X standard, that will give it finally some momentum. I think that's been the big missing piece. We've seen a couple little attempts from Mercedes and others at creating kind of proprietary V2V systems, but this actually seems like it's got a little bit of momentum, and so maybe we'll actually begin to see something like this coming to development. Ford's saying they'll have it in all their new cars starting in 2022. That's a pretty big step forward.
Yeah, well, we actually already had a standard even before CV2X, DSRC, dedicated short-range communications. We had a huge pilot with many thousands of vehicles in Ann Arbor, including my wife's vehicle for a number of years. And that's already been proven out and validated, and that's based on Wi-Fi technology. Some of the other companies decided they wanted to use cellular instead, which has the potential to have longer range, better bandwidth. And now there's a battle going on. Ultimately, it will probably end up falling in favor of CV2X over DSRC, but we do have some DSRC stuff out there from Cadillac, and Toyota also announced that they're going to do DSRC starting in 2021. We'll see if they move forward with that or switch camps.
Looking forward into the year ahead, we've been talking a little bit about interesting startups doing interesting things. Are there any companies that you guys think are particularly interesting that we should keep an eye on in the year ahead? Companies that are doing interesting things that in the next 12 months we'll be maybe talking about this time next year?
Particular companies, I've seen a lot that's intriguing in the space of mapping, mapping terrain, mapping the roads. I'm just really intrigued by that. I think it's amazing what we could do if we could actually map an evolving pothole
Yeah.
And so if each vehicle that goes over it could actually sense the depth of it and feed that back to MDOT, they could understand the severity of the problem. And so there are a few companies I've seen that are working beyond just the GPS mapping of it, but actually the terrain mapping and using the vehicles that are out there traveling to get terrain mapping of the roads. So I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, and there's a lot of companies, as I mentioned earlier, that are focusing on very specific aspects of the software, like the prediction engine. There's one out of Massachusetts called Perceptive Automata that is using some behavioral science. They've got a bunch of behavioral scientists on their team, and using that to try to develop a machine learning system that can essentially read body language, from using the cameras on the vehicle to predict what pedestrians are going to do. Much the same way humans, read very subtle cues in the other people's movements. They're trying to do the same thing with a machine learning system. And then, on the hardware side, the sensors, there's a bunch of sensor companies, especially LiDAR companies, that are getting closer to a lower cost, mass production LiDAR sensor that's going to be more capable. And then, on the larger, at the higher end, the vehicle side, companies like Zoox, who got the first license to operate an autonomous mobility service in California, although they still have to keep a safety driver in there. And Voyage is actually a really interesting company. They're pretty small, but what they're doing is they're actually focusing on a specific niche, deploying automated vehicles for mobility services in retirement communities. And they have a small fleet of vehicles in a very large retirement community in Florida called The Villages, north of Orlando. So focusing on providing mobility for the elderly is an interesting approach, where you're focused on a more limited environment, you have a smaller problem set to deal with.
It's a great test situation.
Yeah.
It is, because they need it.
Yep.
It solves a problem. Their range is generally not that far, so it definitely provides a great environment, and they can study what even the hurdles are within a 15-mile radius.
Yeah.
I think that's the greatest density of golf carts in the world, as far as I know, in the villages. That's
Yeah.
very interesting.
Actually, yeah,
very interesting test case. You mentioned LiDAR startups. Luminar, I think, is a really interesting startup, a Florida-based company working on lower-cost LiDAR technologies, but also interestingly using a different wavelength for their LiDAR, basically enabling them to have greater range and greater power without worrying about burning out anybody's retinas, which is actually a
Yeah, they're
valid
using
problem.
a 1550 nanometer LiDAR, which is eye safe, so you can, as you say, use more power. But it's also a little more expensive. The LiDAR, the lasers themselves are a little more expensive than the 905 nanometer lasers that most companies are using. And there's, but there are other risks of damage to other things. We saw another company at CES last week that also is doing 1550 nanometer LiDAR, and you probably saw some pictures that were posted online from somebody who took a photograph of one of their demo vehicle and actually damaged the sensor in their camera. It, permanently damaged the sensor when one of the laser beams hit the sensor. So, there's still things to be worked out.
A whole brave new world of problems to figure out in terms of paint colors too, is something we're learning that's going to need to change as well. And also at CES, I forgot to mention before, we saw an interesting development from FLIR, a company that makes forward-looking infrared, usually for military applications, actually building a sensor that's intended for autonomous vehicles, which is something that I don't think I certainly knew was a missing piece, and I'm not sure that they've defined that it will be a missing piece, but basically a new type of sensor for autonomous cars looking at infrared. Do you guys think that that's actually a missing piece for autonomous cars, or is that just FLIR being a little bit optimistic, perhaps?
I think it's definitely another beneficial piece of information, because it can help to distinguish between living objects and something that's not alive. For example, if you go past a billboard that has somebody's face on it, the camera can look at that and see that it's a face, and might decide that it's a pedestrian, but it's actually not a human pedestrian that you have to worry about. A thermal imaging camera would be able to distinguish, okay, that's clearly not a living person there, and so you have more information there to work with, especially like at night. FLIR is probably best known for night vision. They're, where optical cameras have problems to deal with those situations, a thermal imaging camera can come in there. FLIR's not the only one doing it. There's an Israeli startup called ADASky, which over here, the magnetic Morelli booth in their smart corner module, they've actually got one of ADASky's sensors incorporated into that. But the problem up until now, the reason why most companies haven't used thermal imaging until now is because those sensors are much, much more expensive. They were in the $4,000 to $5,000 range, similar to LiDAR. And so now, they're developing sensors specifically for these kinds of applications that will be much lower cost, down into the hundreds of dollars.
Hey, the more the merrier, because we're using LiDAR and radar and camera imaging, and we still can't really develop proper judgment and an unpredictable intersection. So yeah, if you can tell the density or the heat map of an object and help the software understand what it is, it's fantastic. So the price will come down at some point.
Yep.
All right. You're all up to speed now on the state of autonomy over the last 12 months. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Dave and Sam. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.